You're listening to Parenting Our Future. I'm parenting expert Robbin McManne, author of The Yelling Cure and founder of Parenting for Connection. My podcast is all about providing you with the tools and solutions you need in all different areas of your parenting so you can create strong connections with your kids, get all the cooperation you want, and live a life that is full of joy and connection. And by the way, the tools and solutions that you're looking for in your parenting don't just live in each episode of my show, they're also in my free membership site, The Parent Toolbox, where you can access tools created by myself and my brilliant guests that cover everything from helping your kids to sleep, managing meltdowns, reducing overwhelm, to getting your kids to listen the first time, and so much more. Join the Parent Toolbox so you can download and use the tools that are ready on the site, and each week a brand new tool is added. And of course, the best part is it's absolutely free to join and to stay in. You can go to www.parent-toolbox.com today. Now, before we get into this episode, I want to share with you another podcast that I think you're going to find really interesting. It's called Didn't I Just Feed You? It's a weekly candid conversation about feeding our families, even for parents who hate to cook. Hosts Stacey Billis and Megan Splon are two food professionals who get real about feeding kids, tweens, and teens because they're also busy working moms, so they get it. They talk about how to turn things like nachos into a legit family dinner, to the magic of meatballs, to solving the after-school snack problem, even reducing kitchen waste and debt all at once. They chat with guests from Food Network stars to everyday moms who, let's be honest, are the real experts. In fact, Didn't I Just Feed You is a staple on the iTunes Top 100 food podcasts and the only food podcast made with parents in mind. Stacey and Megan are on a mission to make cooking easier, more delicious, and maybe even a little bit more fun. Find Didn't I Just Feed You wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Now, you can also find Stacey and Megan on Instagram and Facebook as @Didn't I Just Feed You. Now let's dive into this next episode of Parenting Our Future. Hello, everybody. It's Robbin McManne. I am back with another wonderful guest who's really going to help you in your communication. Communication is so important. The way we communicate with our kids, the way we communicate with our spouses, our friends, our family, so important. And oftentimes we miscommunicate or we misunderstand what people are trying to say and what we're trying to convey. So I am so happy to be talking to Krister Ungerbock. He is a leadership communication expert, former global tech CEO, keynote speaker, and author of the #1 Wall Street Journal best-selling book, which I have in my hands, 22 Talk Shifts, Tools to Transform Leadership. At the age of 42, Krister, after building a $200 million software company, he founded the global Talk Shift movement to transform 100 million marriages, leaders, and lives. Krister, welcome. I'm so happy to have you.
I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to start by throwing out one of your statistics from your book, which says that 72% of people have a frustrating relationship either at home or at work. Is that not 100%? I mean, really?
Well, that research is actually out of date. It was actually done before COVID. So we actually haven't even looked at the numbers, but I can only assume that number is significantly higher as we've all been cooped up in our houses with our spouses.
Yes. Oh, yes. It's very true. My husband now works full-time at home with me full-time at home. And it's lovely. And we've run out of things to talk about. So what is Talk Shift? What is Talk Shift? Tell me about what your movement is all about.
So, there's the movement, and then there's what is a talk shift. So a talk shift is just a simple fill in the blanks phrase, provocative question, or kind of counterintuitive exercise that can shift our perspective or the perspective of those around us. And ultimately, they're tools for creating more compassionate communication at work, at home, as a parent, in our marriages, basically any relationship. And then there was kind of a big reason why, I'm a CEO. So obviously leadership is important to me. But ultimately what I found, and interestingly, like the kind of the middle part of the book is like leaderships, which you would think is really business. But somebody who worked for me like 10 years ago, actually he bought the book right when it was published, and I was sitting in California. I got a text from him. I hadn't heard from him in years. And he said, "Hey, are you supposed to cry while reading this book, asking for a friend?" And I said,
really?
"Elliot, what chapter made you cry?" And it was one of the chapters in the leadership section of the book. And I said, "Why did it make you cry?" And he said, "It made me realize how I lead my daughter." And so a lot of even though it's a leadership book, and like on the surface, some of the tools seem like they're things that, only if you were a leader at work. Many of those leadership tools are really about leadership in relationship and creating commitment from others, whether that's a child, a spouse, a coworker, or boss, or whatever it may be.
Okay. What do you mean by that? Creating commitment?
Well, in the business world, we talk about employee engagement. And I think it's kind of interesting that the word engagement that we use in business is the same word that we use before we get married. Huh. We get engaged. And so ultimately, whether you're married for a year or a day or 50 years, ultimately it's about how does our communication create commitment from others.
Okay. So when you talk about it in terms of a parenting dynamic, creating commitment with your child to what? Listen to you, what do you mean by that?
Well, it could be anything like clean your room, or, so I think you mentioned like something we can say, you should clean your room. You need to clean your room. In talk shift number 3, we talk about eliminating modal verbs, which is could, should, would, can, and reframing those as either more directive, clean your room, please clean your room, consider cleaning your room. And so by changing these subtle changes to our words, we can actually have different outcomes. Or would you consider cleaning your room? And I think cleaning your room is a kind of a trivial example, right?
Yeah.
Probably would just tell our children, just go clean your room. But imagine it's something that really is something that, I think that as one of the reasons I think is really powerful is someone who leads in a business context kind of has some power over people, right? So we can just ask them to do things and they will do them. But parenting and marriage is a little bit more difficult. We actually have to get people to be committed to doing things on their own. And so now if we can create that same kind of commitment in our work relationships and friendship relationships, like that's actually a higher bar than the kind of communication that you need to use, in a business setting.
Okay. So you just mentioned modal verbs, right? Could, should, can, those. And I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, to me, when you say you should, do this, there's sort of judgment there. right. And so when you say, can you consider, it's really like, would you be willing, or, that sort of thing, right? So a bit more, I'm not quite sure how to define the difference, but language matters. So maybe we can talk about that for a little bit.
Well, I think that so one of the things that I think people, when they read the book, is that should one is really, because I think one thing that happens when people read the book is they become more aware of not only their own words, but the words that others around them use. And like when you notice that should, could, would thing, you'll see this happen like tens of times per day in depending on how much you're talking, but observing how other people do it. And it's also, a lot of these talk shifts are also how we speak to ourselves. Like, I should go work out, right? Like, how do you really want to go work out if you say I should go work out to yourself? Like, I don't. Usually that means like I'm gonna sit on the couch for another 30 minutes.
Yeah. Well, and what I like about what you talk about, right? So you've got a couple examples here, like you should arrive earlier, you could arrive earlier, if you would have arrived earlier, right? And replace it with please arrive earlier, consider arrive earlier. And really the problem that you say in here is that most people don't want to be directed to behave according to the wishes of somebody else, which I talk about a lot as counter will, right? Yeah. That it's the will to do the opposite of what somebody is telling me to do because I feel manipulated or coerced, or like, you can't tell me what to do, right? So it doesn't work anyway. So you need the talk shift, right?
Exactly. It often does as you said, the opposite of the result that we were hoping for.
Yeah. Even if you were going to do that thing and somebody says, well, I bet you're going to do that now. You're like, nope, I won't do it then. Just because you told me, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of people kind of, so one person who commented said, oh, I read this book and I thought it was like in the early part, I thought it was just going to be this touchy feely BS. But ultimately, because asking someone whether they would clean their room or arrive earlier, you're like, well, I'm just going to tell them and they're going to do it. But the challenge, as we say, is but often people don't. So what is your outcome? Do you want to be directive and demanding, or do you actually want to get the request that you're making that the person actually does it? And so,
yeah. Yes, hello, yes. So tell me then, what do you suggest? I mean, I know what I would say, but what do you suggest if you say, please consider arriving earlier, and the person says, I can't, no.
Well, that's a conversation, right? So maybe they can't, if I said you should arrive earlier and we never actually had the conversation about the fact that, I don't know, maybe they need to drop their children off at school or, something, they have a conflict, let's have that conversation about what it is. And I think that's sometimes a big part of the talk shifts is also about giving people permission to actually not do the things we ask. Because what happens if they don't do the things we ask? We just get more and more frustrated. We don't know why, right? And then we just say it louder, we say it more frequently, and we never actually got to the point of understanding, well, what is the barrier or obstacle? And so let's say they say, well, I can't arrive earlier. Okay, well, what's the reason behind that? And then one of the other talk shifts would be so what are 3 things that you could do to kind of remove those obstacles, or what obstacles are standing in the way of you kind of doing what I'm requesting? And then we can have either I can help brainstorm with them what some solutions to those problems are, or even better, encourage them to actually come up with solutions to those problems that they're committed to.
I love it. I love it. That is so aligned with what I say in parenting is, okay, so you come up with a no, instead of just saying it louder like we want to do and forcing, which doesn't ever help, or we punish or whatever. And that just creates so much disconnection. Instead is to say, oh, okay, well, why? How come? So the curiosity piece is huge. And then I always say, okay, so you're saying no, I need to understand why, and that thing still needs to get done. So how are we going to work this out? And that doesn't mean we have to be flexible, and our child may have to be flexible too. So sorry, go ahead.
No, and I think it's kind of to your point. It's we're as parents, we want to raise resourceful children, right?
Yeah.
So one of the other chapters that is also in the leadership section that most readers say is one of the best ones. It's about leading people to their solutions, not yours. In a work context, bosses often give all the solutions. Well, parents do too. And how do you expect to raise resourceful children if somebody says, I can't be on time, and you say, well, here's the solution to your problem? Let them solve this, and they're going to be more likely to actually be committed to the solution when they come up with it.
Right. And so that means you better be a good listener. Yeah. And one of the things I tell parents is to talk less and listen more, right? Listen to what your kids have to say, because isn't it more powerful to solicit ideas and thoughts from your kids than to give them a lecture of all the ways it should work? When was the last time a lecture worked with anybody?
Yeah, and we still do it. I'd still do it too. I think that one of the things
Perfect.
You talked about listening. One of the chapters is called The Secret to Listening is Talking. And so I was a software engineer and learned to program at age 12. And then we have this thing called garbage in, garbage out, right? If you make a cake with bad ingredients, then you're going to have a bad cake, right? So the counterintuitive thing with listening is that if you ask questions that you're not dying to know the answers to, then you probably won't be as interested in listening to the answers. So what if the key to better listening was not necessarily a problem with our ears, but it's a problem with our mouth? Meaning what the questions we're asking and how we're asking them.
Right. And oftentimes a question is a statement in disguise,
Yes.
right? Yeah. I'm trapping you. I'm trying to manipulate this situation. Okay. Okay. Well, that's really interesting. So one of the things I love is empathy. And I talk about empathy all the time, use it as one of the main tools in parenting, because for lots of different reasons, partly because our kids don't come to us with fully grown brains. Like, life is frustrating for them. They live in a world of giants. It's got to be hard when you have no control over your life. And all I want is that red balloon, and I can't have it. And it's going to ruin my life as a 4-year-old or a 2-year-old or whatever. So you said here, and I'm going to read this because I love it so much. So this is what I want to sort of start from. So you have talk shift number 18, which is speak like an emotional Einstein using the language of empathy. And you said in your book here, once upon a time, I was an emotional Einstein. An emotional Einstein is someone who intellectually understands emotional intelligence, but is unknowingly speaking thoughts instead of emotions. Totally get that. I have read countless books on emotional intelligence, yet none of these books touched on the subtle but critical changes to our words that are the difference between analytical communication and that disconnects us and emotional communication that connects us.
Yeah.
So I love that. But here's the thing. I think we understand the concept of empathy, putting ourselves in the shoes of somebody else, but we don't know the words of empathy. We don't know the words to say. So let's talk about that a little bit.
I think the simplest one, there's this YouTube video called It's Not About the Nail, like went viral like years ago. And so there's the husband is like, so what empathy isn't is trying to solve the person's problem for them, right? And usually it's just as simple as saying, that sounds hard. That sounds frustrating. That sounds whatever. But I think the other thing that what I found in my personal experience, and I don't think that there's probably a reasonable number of men who have this as well. And I think that, so often when people would ask, when we ask us like, well, how are you feeling? Fine, good. Well, these are not emotions. Fine is not an emotion.
Yeah.
And so what happens is we encourage in the book to shift the question to, what emotion are you experiencing right now? Because it's very hard to answer fine, good, or bad, because those aren't emotions. So, and even in STEM to say the emotion I'm experiencing is blank.
That's a different way of talking. Holy cow.
And again, it's just by changing the words and the fill in the blanks, whether you know, after you get accustomed to it, you may not use all those words, but it's like reminding ourselves. And then the other interesting thing, having learned French and German as an adult when I was opening businesses in Europe, the interesting thing is if you look up the word to feel in a French thesaurus, it's the word sentir. And if you look up in the French thesaurus, you will not see the word penser, which is to think. The same thing in German, but you will see this in English. So the word feel is often a synonym for I think, or I feel, I think. And the antidote to that is usually it happens when I say I feel like, I feel that. And then what's happened is there's actually a thought after that. So the antidote is I feel, and then the next word is always an emotion word: sad, glad, mad, whatever, fill in the word. And I give a couple other tips on like kind of words that are, I call them false emotions. Like I feel judged. Well, whenever it says, if I could say you judged me, that's kind of like a false emotion. Because if I say I feel judged, it's like what I'm really saying is you're judging me. And that's not really emotional communication. It's creating disconnect. Now, in about 99% of the cases, it works that if you have an emotion word that ends in ED, it's really an action that we think someone has done to us. And so by doing that, we can just, again, subtle shifts to our words and simple rules that we can kind of keep in mind when we're having this. And as you know, you don't need to take, it's most important to really think about these rules when we have a really sensitive conversation coming up, and we think about it, like, well, what am I going to say? I feel this, I feel that. I feel, and then think of what is the emotion that we're experiencing. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about those hard conversations, because those happen in marriages and in partnerships and all that kind of stuff. So let's kind of pivot to relationships with our parenting partners, right? Whether whoever that is. So if you want to change the behavior of your spouse or your ex-spouse, how would you go about doing that?
This gets to the heart of why we wrote a leadership book that also can be used in marriage and in parenting. So I just have a story. This happened in May. I was in an Airbnb in a small wine city, and there was this like 65-year-old man, Swiss man, his wife, they'd run the Airbnb. And I was like, hey, would you read the book? And I'll come back and interview you, because we just had this amazing conversation about how language and German, and she's American and whatever. And the next morning I was having breakfast and she came out and she sat down with me. He goes, hey, did Adrian tell you what I gave him for Christmas this year? I said, no. He goes, well, he was opening his Christmas gift, and he opened it and it was a book, and she had the book in her hands, and he goes, oh, thanks for the gift. Hey, wait, didn't you give this book to me 5 years ago? She said, yeah, you didn't read it then. I want you to read it now. And so it was a book about, I mean, the title was something about like anger in marriage or something like that. I don't remember what the title, but it was clearly like, you're only giving that book to your spouse if you're like, we definitely need to work on our communication.
Yeah.
So the reason why we wrote a leadership book is the reality is that many men are more likely to read a book to help them with their career and be a better leader or at work. So it's a little bit of like, imagine like, especially if it was a spouse maybe who doesn't work, gives like, hey, here's a leadership book. Like, my wife gave me a leadership book. I've never gotten a business book from my, and so the intention is that because all of the chapters do cross over, regardless of whether they're in the leadership section or the relationship section of the book, the intention is to meet those men, the career-oriented men, where they are, which is in the business section of the bookstore, not the parenting section or the marriage section of the bookstore, but give them tools. And also what I find is both myself as a man, and I think that actually this happens to anyone, I don't want to make it gender specific, is some of us feel more comfortable practicing these tools. We feel safer practicing them at work. Others feel safer practicing it at home. Like if I have a toxic boss, but I have a great marriage, I can practice these things in my home before I go take them, into my career. Other people are the opposite. If your marriage is like, on the verge of destruction, like people might not feel comfortable practicing at home. They want to find, they'll practice in a different area of their lives. And so that was really kind of the core. And then we did one of the first ever video books. And the intention is that mostly in a personal relationship, you can actually pop the book onto your smart TV and watch it with your spouse. Each chapter is like about TED Talk length. They're about 8 to 10 minutes. And there's something that happens that doesn't happen in an audiobook or reading a book. One, you hear the inflection of how the talk shifts are used, but we actually, because I'm looking directly at the camera, you actually experience a little bit of what it feels like to be spoken to using the talk shifts, which wouldn't even happen if you're, listening to an audiobook, because there's not that eye contact. Right. At least eye contact with the TV in this case. But so, and then the other last thing about the video book, which is really important for getting alignment between parents or even ex-spouses, is so when people get the video book, you have the ability to share any one chapter with anyone, even anonymously. So that ex-spouse who maybe you can go and be like, I really wish he or she would read chapter 13. Yeah. And while we don't encourage passive aggressive behavior in sending it anonymously, we have had a number of people who tend to send it to their boss or their ex-spouse, as with a nice, hey, this might be interesting. And hopefully they don't find it in their spam folder and they actually watch the video.
Yeah. Okay. Let's sort of, can we go through a scenario where, let's say, you've got two parents, right? Husband and wife, and you have a husband, and I'm just going to use an example from that I've heard.
Just be honest, that's how it usually works, but go ahead.
No.
I'm not going to be offended. We could just use it doesn't work the other way. But so we have a husband who doesn't want to do it.
He doesn't want to do anything. I'm thinking of a specific situation here with a client. Husband is not interested in improving his parenting, is not interested in engaging, except for when he's angry. at the behavior. So all the kids experience is dad's mean and dad's not nice. Mom wants to really improve, doesn't know how to get him on the same page. Incidentally, I met him, talked to him, and he's like, nah, she just seems too nice. I'm like, I'm not that nice. But anyway, so how would you start a difficult conversation? And how do you stay untriggered as the one who wants to have the conversation? And how do you create change?
So, well, there's a lot there. The first question would be, if you sparking a talk shift with somebody, would say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how open would you be to reading this book with me? Maybe sending them one chapter at a time, thinking of reading the book and saying, what's the one chapter that they would be interested in? Like, what's a problem that he's having at work or with a friend or with somebody in his family, whatever it is, and be like, hey, this chapter might be interesting, and give you some alternative ways to handle it.
And what if they say, I don't want to read any of it? I don't care. It doesn't look good to me at all.
So there's a separate, I would say there's probably a much deeper issue going on. Like, if I make a request of my spouse and my spouse is unwilling to do anything, like, okay, so what is the need that they're filling? And how do we get to this point that asking a spouse to watch a 8-minute video, they're unwilling to watch an 8-minute video? It's probably at least partly in how we're asking.
Okay.
Or some pattern of behavior or criticism or whatever it has kind of, built up over some months or years. So, my thought would be like, is there something that the person who's asking, in this case would be the wife, I guess, the mother, that, maybe there's something that, in order to get a break in the relationship or get to set a new pattern, that a behavior that person would need to change. Now, it's not okay for somebody to be like, resistant and whatever, but the reason why the book is called Tools to Transform Leadership is because I call it leadership in relationship. Sometimes leadership in relationship is being the first person to apologize, even though somebody else did something equally bad. We can always apologize for our part and make commitments that we're going to do something differently. So I think that, I think that would be without getting and observing the exact way that the person was, asking. But I think that, as you would probably guess, like, if somebody's that resistant, there's some deeper thing that they're really resisting. It's not 8 minutes to watch it. But we did create, one of the other reasons we did create a video book and audiobook is the reality is that women tend to read twice as frequently as men. So watching a video for many men, or just people who just don't enjoy reading, we wanted to make sure that you could use the book to connect with people regardless of what their preferred mode of consuming the content is, video, audio, or a book.
I like that. You've covered all the bases, like no excuses, right?
Exactly.
But that's also that counter will, like, this is going to be good for you. You need to read this, right? So you got to watch those modal verbs, right, as well, and say, please, can you consider watching this video with me, perhaps, right?
Yeah, and I think we're actually getting ready to start a webinar in the next couple of weeks to walk people through this. And I think what happens, and I've been victim of, I've done this before as well in my life, is we pick up a book or whatever, like, oh, you have to read this, right?
Yeah.
But often a better way to do it is actually, what we're going to encourage people to do is, just put it on your nightstand, like, just don't say anything about it. Be the first book, be like, oh, I'm reading this amazing book. Let them come to you. Like, what is it about? Like, and so let them come to you and be like, I actually kind of want to read that book, or give a lot of times when people buy the book from the talkshift.com website, they buy multiple copies and they'll give a copy of the book to someone. Like, so in your case, who's someone who that husband, the example with your client, who's someone that husband would trust? Well, maybe give a copy of the book to that person. And then say, hey, if you think it's good, could you tell Bob, like, this is a really good book?
Yeah.
So influencing from around the person, if you have somebody who's that kind of anchored in not being involved.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too, I'm just going to add in from my own personal experience. My husband is a no before he's a yes. He always says no before he says yes. And one of my kids is just like that too. So I'm always like, I have learned to just wait for it. I don't need to say, come on, this means a lot to me. Come on, just this one time. Can you just please trust me that this is going to be good for you and it's going to really help us? I don't do any of that anymore. I just say, I zip it. I just zip it. And then he will come back because he just needs a minute to process it, to think about it. And maybe every once in a while I have to say, look, just trust me, just watch this one thing, and because we have a good relationship, he does trust me. He will usually come around.
So one of the other talk shift that's kind of used throughout the book is, rather than asking, would you read this book, is to say on a scale of 1 to 10, how open would you be to exploring some or all of this book? And so then they can say, well, I'm a 6. Now, some people often, in their resistance situation, they'll say no, even though the question was on a scale of 1 to 10. But then the follow-up is like, if they say 6 or 7, well, what would be the difference from a 6 or a 9? Would you like to watch the video book or whatever? And then to your point, and this would just be the talk shift way of doing what you just said with your husband, is just my request is that you read this book with me. And then walk out of the room, leave it. I'm not going to convince you. I'm simply saying, my request, I'm not going to give you the reasons. I'm not going to convince you. I'm not going to lay out a legal case for why you should spend 4 hours reading a short book.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, as your wife and as the parent of our children, my request is that you spend 4 hours with me and read this book. And then what we do is then we encourage people who read the book or watch it together at the end of each chapter to say, hey, this is one of those talk shifts that I'd like you to practice more with me. And what we find is 2 people rarely request of each other the same talk shift, right? Someone would be like, hey, there is a chapter, I think one of the most powerful chapters is chapter 19, is about anger. And so the book was written where even kids as young as 8 or 10 could actually watch that video book. And that parent could, if the husband is unwilling to is always this angry person, understanding what drives anger, even the children, hopefully, depending on how old they are, like certainly teenagers would be old enough to understand, when dad's angry, that's just a symptom that has another emotion that he's not talking about.
Yeah. Yes. And I talk about anger being like an iceberg, right? Anger is what you see at the top, but below the surface is all these other emotions that you don't see. What you see is the expression of all of those, which is anger. And anger, really, you boil it down, it's other emotions. I totally agree. Okay, but here's the thing. I want to get back to, we keep going. We have examples of reading the book, but I want to say, I want you to participate in parenting more. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how open would you be to talking about ways we can come together, parent together? Is that a good way to start?
Yeah. That would be, and then, depending on what they answer, like what are the obstacles or barriers to, being more committed? Or another way to frame it is how open would you be, or how committed are you?
Okay, how open or committed? And then how do you follow that up? How open would you be to spending more time with the kids? How committed are you to our family? Like, we could go it could go wrong fast, right?
Yeah.
So what's the best?
I don't know. I think that, if we ask how committed are you to the family, then that probably is, there's really only, it's best to stay away from questions where there's really only one right answer.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So I like how open are you to talking about, our roles together in this family and how we parent and how, right. And then I like what you say. So they throw out a number and you say, okay, well, what's the difference between a 6 and a 9? How can I get you to a 9, or how, right? Come up with some solutions. So I think also what is really important here is not to take what the other person says personally, right? And to recognize that they're feeling their own feelings right now. And it's not about you, it's about them and whatever story they've told themselves, whatever is going on for them, right? Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I talk about having like intentional conversations in the work that I do, right? Because sometimes we do have to have a big conversation with a spouse when we want to have some change. And I sort of, I talk about really the same stuff you do to a certain degree. And that sometimes when you want to have a conversation, that brings up emotions in somebody else. And then what we're up against is their armor. And their armor is, well, you don't do that either. And I want, you blah, 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 blah. And it's not nice. And so it would be so easy to attach to each one of those, well, what about you? Or I saw you say this and do this, and you're not perfect either. And you want me, all this. I always say, be like Neo in the Matrix and pretend that all those words are like those bullets that are missing you, right? And you just let them fly past you, because what you're waiting for is you want to get to the place underneath where I don't think you trust me, or I just don't feel like I'm a good enough mom or dad. Right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And I think that like before kind of trying to, let's say, control the other person by getting them to engage in some behavior, talk about the feelings. Like, I am afraid as a mom or a dad. I'd like, what is this going to look like for our children if this continues? Like, I'm afraid that I'm not being a good mom or dad, or I feel afraid. So like, talking about those and getting behind the anger, or stepping around the anger. The other thing I think is, and I have this happen with every once in a while, my wife gets, I tend to be very, very calm with most everyone in my life, except for my father, because he's the one who in the past has triggered me. I've gotten to a point where I'm calm with him as well. But so whenever someone starts saying those things, like to hurt us, like you did this or that, the most important thing is just not to engage and just stay calm. And like, they're like, when someone's in that state, there's no way that you're going to convince them, like engaging. And he says, Dr. John Gottman says, like, the best thing to do is it takes like 20 to 30 minutes for someone's physiologically, when they're in that state of anger, it takes 20 or 30 minutes minimum for someone's heart rate to slow down and for them to actually have a meaningful, compassionate conversation. So coming up with a way to actually exit the conversation rather than just escalating and going around in circles for 15, 20 minutes or an hour, or however long it is really critical. Knowing that you're not going to win the argument in the moment.
Right. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but what I wanted to say is, so when you are met with big emotion, understand that rational thought is really not there necessarily. And it takes about, and the Gottman Institute, John Gottman, I mean, they're the best, right? And to just say, okay, like now, like to tell yourself and maybe even your spouse, like now is obviously not the time to talk. Right. Yeah. And give that time. And boy, that takes a lot of self-control, I think, right? To disengage, because you also have all of your big emotions too. And I know that of course I'm not perfect. And there is sort of that nanosecond where it does feel good to like yell, where it does feel good to just like, oh, I just want to tell you I hate you right now, or whatever it is, right? But that's not going to get you any closer to connected communication in a connected relationship, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's really like, ultimately that's that leadership in relationship, is being able to remain calm when maybe the other person is not, letting it, waiting to get to a point where you can have a conversation about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had, my oldest son can be a lot, to say the least sometimes. And I talk about him all the time. He's just the most wonderful human, and he's big emotions. And so there are times where he comes at me. And I'm thinking, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a situation where it was a misunderstanding and he came at me and I was like, oh, it was like a slap in the face. And it was hard for me not to respond or react when there was a lot of blame that he was blaming me. He was calling me a liar. He was, all this stuff. And I'm really trying to let it go. And also I was about to hop on a call with a client, and this was like 15 minutes that I had for a break between clients so that I could just decompress myself. So yeah, sometimes it happens at a moment that you're not ready for it or whatever. And to keep calm, it takes practice. And I want to say practice intentionally, because it's not about perfection. You can't be perfect all the time. You just can't be. Right? It's a practice.
I totally agree.
you can always apologize, right?
Yeah, well, that's actually the last chapter in the book is about how to apologize, because I think often we don't really realize, many of us don't know how to apologize. I definitely didn't know how to apologize before I wrote the book, and I think that is actually probably one of the most important skills, because sometimes, it could be that moment where you say, I hate you or whatever. Well, those things, when we don't process them and apologize and work through them, those are the things that potentially, a spouse who's like, I'm not going to read a book, or I'm not going to engage with this parenting or change my style. The real thing that may have driven that may have been something that happened years ago. In fact, often it is something that happened years ago. And until we know what that is, in fact, I just had a conversation with a friend of mine who I kind of felt some distance, and I just reached out to him. I said, hey, could we kind of have a conversation about, like, what is it that I've done or said that's kind of created this distance? And I remember I said, I can think of like 10 things that maybe I did, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's an 11th or 12th thing that I don't even know.
Yeah.
And the conversation, he goes, you know what, like 7 years ago, I sent you a survey that I asked, and you sent me an email back saying, hey, I don't really know you as well because I don't see you. And my email must have been much more harsh, but I wasn't interacting with this person like on a day-to-day basis. And I just didn't know if I felt really qualified to give him feedback on his kind of survey about his passions or something like that. And so anyway, it was the 11th or 12th thing that I had no idea about. That was the thing that he was like, yeah, that created some distance, 7 or 8 years ago. And interestingly, like, I only started to sense the distance in the last 2 years. I had some totally different story that I made up in my mind.
Right. How interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is right on. I mean, we operate from the place we were hurt the most, I think, too, right? And so here you are 7 years later, like, oh, we're just bringing this up now, but that stuff does fester, doesn't it? Yeah.
Sometimes, like Brene Brown, we always talk about seeing people and being seen and all that. I think the biggest challenge in relationships is often not seeing people, but unseeing who they were.
Right. Because we're flawed, right? That's a shared human experience, right? That we make mistakes, right? Is that what you mean?
Well, often when people change, and interesting, this happens in like weight loss, like, the weight loss, people say that sometimes someone will lose like 50 or 100 pounds or more, and their body image doesn't actually change for like 6 months or a year after that. They still feel like, the person that they were before. But I think the same thing is like in relationships. I know this was my father, who was kind of my most difficult relationship in my life. There were points where he actually had stopped some of the behaviors that were kind of the core of our issue in our relationship, but I still saw him as those behaviors. I wouldn't allow myself to see that he was no longer doing those behaviors. And that's why I say sometimes we need to unsee who people were in order to see who they are. The current version, not the version that hurt us years or decades ago.
Yeah, that's a challenge. I think we do that with our kids, right? We still see our kids as kids, even though they're grown adults, right? Often.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's what happens when you label behavior instead of being curious about it. You label the behavior, and then that's all you see is what you've labeled. And it takes you further away from curiosity and even compassion, right? And it doesn't allow you to see the change, because people do change and evolve and grow. Yeah. But if you've just sort of written them off like, no, you're just a jerk.
Yeah. I remember a story related to this, like, we don't see our kids, like a friend of mine who was a partner in a big like accounting firm. He told me a story of like some person who started as an intern there, and they were now in their 30s or 40s. And he said, you need to leave this firm because you'll never make partner. And then I said, why? He said, because all the people around here can't forget that you were the 19-year-old intern. And we do that with our kids all the time, right? They could be 35 years old and we're like, oh, like we like project some behavior that they did when they were 10 years old at soccer practice, and like, oh, you're doing it again. It's like, no, I'm 35 years old or 20 years old, And so, it's a challenge.
Well, and I think too that those, especially from the parent-child piece, is that when you do label that behavior, our kids take that on. And they say, oh, well, then I must be a jerk. I must be selfish. Like that was always my thing. My dad decided that I was selfish, and that's how he saw me. And in fact, that's even how my sister sees me, because I remember having this conversation with her not too long ago, because my dad decided that was true for me. So that's how he saw me. I took that on, and that's the record that plays in my head. And what that cost me is my self-esteem. And it also made me this people pleaser, and I felt like I had to make sure people knew that I was a kind and good person before they even had a chance to decide if I was or not, by overdoing things, and that's a disempowering belief.
Yeah, for me, the words were undisciplined and lazy. Those are the ones that my father called me. And like I had a coach once said to me, like, so Krister, you work like 60, 80, 100 hours, like, especially when you were in your 20s, and you still work, 50 hours a week. Like, lazy people don't work 50 or 60 hours a week. But still, because my father said that to me multiple times while I was young, it probably hasn't said it to me in 25 years. But as you know, those words that we speak to our children and how we label them as parents, it's like a sponge. It just seeps in, and it's hard to get the smell out.
Yeah. And we have to be very careful of the way we talk, how we label our kids, because labels don't actually show you who the real person is at all. Mm-hmm. Right? You miss what's really going on with them. So this is just, I think this is so helpful to hear this, and to really understand, communication. We can really get such deeper relationships and be better leaders of our family, of our businesses, of our workplace, by being kind, compassionate, curious, empathetic, right? And choosing these words differently. And I want, I think in terms of sort of this male dominated world in business and that sort of thing, it's not weakness to be kind and compassionate at all. In fact, that's what employees need. That's what people need in order to want to work for you, to be more productive. People don't quit companies, they quit bosses, right? So this is,
they don't leave marriages, they leave spouses.
Yeah.
So I think that was one. I had an interesting conversation after the book was published with two marriage counselors. They had been in marriage counselors, a husband-wife marriage counselor team, and they've been counselors. I don't know, they're in their 70s, so they've got probably 80 or 100 years of marriage counseling under their belt. And I asked them, so what are the things that unhappy wives and unhappy husbands have been saying on your couch for decades? And they said, he doesn't listen, he doesn't appreciate me, always criticizing, always solving my problems for me. And I said, that's really interesting, because those are the exact same things that unhappy employees say about their bosses.
How interesting. Wow.
So maybe leadership in business and leadership in family and marriage is not so different after all.
Right. Okay, I think that is a really good place to end. Krister, thank you for this. This is really, really important. We need to know how to better communicate. And you are going to give the listeners something really special. So when we were just talking about how do you have a conversation with your spouse or your boss, whomever, that you need to have a really intentional or a change, you need to make a change, is to really use that on a scale of 1 to 10, starting with that conversation. And so you mentioned that you have your book in videos. And so you're going to give us that video. And so that normally would cost people. And this is what your gift is to everybody listening. And that is just from the book. It's Talk Shift number 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. I think that's going to be a tremendous help. And that's something you can watch with your spouse. Yay. Yeah. So
the other thing I could also add is we'll also give you the 13 chapter. So if you do have a spouse who is it's one of the chapters out of the business section of the book. Okay. The tool works equally well. It's the lead people to their solutions, not yours. So it works equally well with children. But if you do have a spouse who's resistant to reading a book like this, and maybe a business chapter might be a better one to start them off, then that could be one you could share.
Oh, that's so awesome. Okay. Yes, we will take it. We'll take it all. Thank you so much. So the book is 22 Talk Shifts, Tools to Transform Leadership in Business, in Partnership, and in Life. This is so great. Thank you so much, Krister, for being here and for helping us to communicate better. You know, it's going to make the world a better place when we can really talk about what we're feeling, what we're needing, without judgment, without criticism, and all that kind of good stuff. It's good for our work, our family, and for our lives. Thank you so much. And you can go to talkshift.com to find out more about Krister and the book. And tell us about the book and all the proceeds. Where do they go?
Oh, so yeah, when I sold my company, I decided that everything we do, I don't take any compensation from this. 100% of the profits go to the cause of changing the words of the world. So we intend to pay our employees well, but I'm the lowest paid person in the company at $0. So
wow, that's great. All right, so that is a really beautiful intention, and I think that really speaks to the kind of person you are. So that is really wonderful. All right, so I hope people will check it out, and if nothing else, please go to the Parent Toolbox, look for Talk Shift number 5 and number 13, and it will dramatically change the results that you're getting, the conversations that you're having. Again, Krister Ungerbock, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening to this edition of my podcast, Parenting Our Future. I'm parent coach Robbin McManne, and if you're enjoying this podcast, please share it with someone who you think might also need to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe, and if you like my work, I would be grateful if you gave me a 5-star rating. For those of you who like my content and want more, visit me at yellingcurebook.com to get your copy of my book and to find other resources to help you. Until next time, I am wishing you and your family peace and